Have you ever felt like you were going through an identity crisis? Well, if you have Erik Erikson to thank for that. Erik Erikson was born in 1902 in Germany. After high school, he moved to Florence, Italy, and became an art teacher for children. He used the Montessori method to study psychoanalysis in Vienna. A fun fact about Erik is that he did not receive a formal degree. In 1930, he married his wife, Joanne. She was a dancer and an artist. Luckily, their family escaped the Nazis and immigrated to Boston in the United States in 1933. Erikson served as a professor at many colleges, including Yale, UC Berkeley, UC San Francisco, and even Harvard. While at these institutions, he conducted many studies on children, especially children who were considered emotionally challenged. Now let's take a look at what Erik Erikson is most known for, which are the stages of psychosocial development. This was first published in 1950 by Erikson. It's a theory of social development that tells us that humans will go through different stages of psychological crises. They could have a negative or a positive effect on a person's personality. According to his theory, if a person doesn't successfully complete a stage, they might miss out on gaining the personality characteristics that could help them solve an issue later down the line. This could create a person that doesn't have a good sense of self. However, his theory does state that the stages can be worked out later at times in life. Let's dig deeper into Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. The ages range from infancy to 65 years plus. Each stage of the psychosocial development gives an approximate age, a psychosocial crisis or task, and what virtue would be developed if this task was completed successfully. The first stage happens at infancy and deals with trust versus mistrust. When a child is born, they are completely dependent on their caregiver. When a child gets upset, the caregiver comforts them. If these needs are met, hope is developed, and they develop a sense of basic trust. The second stage begins at 18 months and lasts till about 3 years, and deals with the task of autonomy versus doubt. When a child is learning how to do things for themselves, they can become encouraged or discouraged. When caregivers provide encouragement, they will exercise will and do things for themselves. If they don't, they may feel discouraged, doubtful, or even ashamed. The third stage happens when the child is in preschool, and this stage deals with initiative versus guilt. Around this age, children begin to become more independent. When they're encouraged by their caregiver, they will learn to take the initiative to do tasks and carry out plans independently. If not, they may feel guilty or discouraged. Stage 4 deals with industry or inferiority, and this happens from ages 5 to 13 years old. At this stage, children really become aware that they are individuals and they seek accomplishments when they play sports or do clubs, etc. If teachers or your caregivers can give support to a student, they feel productive and they have the pleasure of applying themselves to tasks. But if they're not receiving positive reinforcement for their accomplishments, they could feel inferior or even incompetent. Stage 5 happens during adolescence and deals with identity versus confusion. During adolescence, a child is trying to figure out who they are. They want to establish goals and priorities. These goals and priorities become a part of a person's identity. If children are not able to establish their identity, it may lead to confusion about their goals and their needs. Stage 6 is all about love. It's one of our first big chunks of time and happens between the ages of 21 and 39 years old. During this time, it's very important to establish and build relationships. If a person can have a meaningful relationship with their friends and their family, they're able to develop intimacy with others. If a person struggles with those relationships, they may end up feeling isolated or lonely. The 7th stage deals with generativity versus stagnation and can happen between the ages of 40 to 65 years old. When an adult is at this stage, they feel a sense of care and responsibility and want to share what they know with the younger generation. They want to feel like they've contributed to the world. If they're able to do that in the form of a mentor, they can feel successful. But if not, they may be bitter and unhappy, which could lead to resentment and isolation from family, friends, and society. The last stage of development starts around age 65 and lasts until death. This deals with integrity versus despair. If you're satisfied with life, you may age gracefully and feel good or prideful when people ask you about the things that have happened in your life. However, if you don't, when you look back at your life, you may fall into despair. When that happens, you may end up living the latest part of your life with regret. Here are some important vocabulary words and their definitions that may help you understand Eriks's stages of psychosocial development a little bit more clearly. Thanks for listening.
My theorist is Jean Piaget. I am Melissa Williams. Jean Piaget, also known as Jean William Fritz Piaget, was born August 9, 1896 in Switzerland. He died at the age of 84. He had a spouse, Valentine, and they had three children, Jacqueline, Larinette, and Lucien. He studied genetic epistemology, a theory that combines cognitive development with an epistemological view. He studied the development of the thinking processes in children. His theory is that children moved from a position of egocentrism to sociocentrism. He founded the International Center for Genetic Epistemology in Geneva. He was one of the most influential development psychologists of the 20th century, and he is best known for the theory of cognitive development. He believed that early cognitive development involves actions and changes in mental operations. Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development suggests that children move through four different stages of learning. His theory focuses not only on understanding how children acquire knowledge, but also on understanding the nature of intelligence. He defined his four stages of development in children, with the first one being sensory motor stage, which is birth to 2 years. And one bullet point from this was to realize that their actions can cause things to happen in the world around them. And I believe this is so true. I have a granddaughter, and when we put her in the high chair, she will drop something intentionally because we know we're going to pick it up. She thinks it's a game. Pre-operational stage, ages 2 to 7. begin to think symbolically and learn to use words and pictures to represent objects. Well, we see that with our kindergartners. And the concrete operational stage from ages 7 to 11, thinking becomes more logical and organized, but still very concrete. So they're progressing. Um, and then the last stage, formal operation stage, ages 12 and up, begin to think more about the moral and philosophical, ethical, social, and political um, views. And we know when we become teenagers, we are all concerned about, our appearance and things like that. Important concepts. In Piaget's view, a schema includes both a category of knowledge and the process of obtaining that knowledge. As experiences happen, this new information is used to modify, add to, or change previously existing schemas. For example, a child may have a schema about a type of animal, such as a dog. If the child's sole experience has been with small dogs, a child might believe that all dogs are small, furry, and have 4 legs. Suppose then that the child encounters an enormous dog. The child will take in this new information, modifying the previously existing schema to include these new observations. Assimilation, in the example above, seeing a dog and labeling it dog, is a case of assimilating the animal into the child's dog schema. Accommodation is new schemas may also be developed during this process. Piaget believed that all children try to strike a balance between assimilation and accommodation using a mechanism he called equilibration. Equilibration helps explain how children can move from one stage of thought to the next. So some key words that I took from my research was cognitive, and it's defined as relating to, being, or involving conscious intellectual activity, such as thinking, reasoning, or remembering. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the nature, origin, extent, and limits of human knowledge. Schema describes both the mental and physical actions involved in understanding and knowing, categories of knowledge that help us to interpret and understand the world. Assimilation is the process of taking in new information into our already existing schemas. Accommodation is another part of an adaptation. It is the ability to change existing schemas in light of new information. And equilibration is to describe how information is balanced with our existing knowledge. And lastly, here are my resources I got from Very Well Mind and the Famous People. Thank you for listening.
Now you will be learning about the theorist Lawrence Kohlberg. Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development focuses on the thinking process that occurs when one decides whether a behavior is right or wrong. Lawrence Kohlberg was born October 25, 1927 in New York, and he died January 17, 1987 in Boston. Kohlberg became very interested in Jean Piaget's work while he was earning his doctorate degree. He interviewed 72 lower and middle class white boys, presenting them with a moral dilemma. The responses of the children became the basis of his theory of moral development. Here you can read more about Kohlberg's theory of moral development, including explanation and the different stages. Here is a comparison between Kohlberg and Gilliam. On the next two slides, you can read about the Heinz dilemma. Here are some questions that Kohlberg asked children. He used these answers to discover how moral reasoning changes as people grow older. On the next two slides, you can read key vocabulary terms and their definitions that are associated with this theory. After contracting a parasitic infection in 1971, Kohlberg became physically ill and depressed. He committed suicide in 1987.
Carol Gilligan is an American feminist, ethicist, and psychologist, best known for her work on ethical community and relationships. She received her BA in English Literature from Swarthmore College, a master's degree in clinical psychology from Radcliffe, and a PhD in social psychology from Harvard. She began her teaching career at the University of Chicago, moved to Harvard in 1967, where she worked with both Erikson and Kohlberg. She was a Pitt Professor at the Center for Gender Studies in Jesus College at the University of Cambridge, and is now a Professor of Humanities and Applied Psychology at New York University. She is best known for her book In a Different Voice, which criticized Kohlberg's stages of moral development. Gilligan has been recognized by many institutions and organizations for her efforts in the area of women's advancement and moral psychology. In addition to the Grawemeyer Award for Education, she has also received the Heinz Award under Human Condition and was named one of the most influential people of the year by Time magazine in 1996. She has also published works of fiction and developed a full-length play based on the Scarlet Letter. Gilligan is a pioneer in the field of gender difference psychology, which argues that the sexes tend to think differently, particularly when it comes to moral problems. Gilligan argues that women's ways of thinking are often undervalued compared to men. Her best-known contribution to psychology is her critique of Kohlberg's theory of moral development. In 1982, she published In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development. Her book detailed her criticism of Kohlberg's theory and her views on female morality. Gilligan's theories propelled her to the forefront of the feminist movement, and her followers joined her in encouraging society to view women and men equally in terms of influence and justice. In a Different Voice was a landmark piece for at least two reasons. First, it cast doubt on the generalizability of Kohlberg's theory of morality. Second, it cemented a new form of feminist critique. Psychology, Gilligan argued, had been unknowingly ignoring the voices and experiences of half the human race. Difference feminism, as her perspective has come to be called, highlights the different qualities of both men and women, but asserts that no value judgment can be placed upon them. In her book, Gilligan outlined her findings on female moral development and decision-making, drawing on studies with children and university students. In Kohlberg's classic studies, females appeared to be deficient in moral reasoning when compared to similarly aged men. This was true of both children and adults. However, Gilligan had noticed a problem. Kohlberg's early work in developing his moral stage theory was based on studies done with only white male participants. In light of this, she began working with female participants facing a personally and politically charged dilemma: whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. The results of her study indicated that women were not deficient. They were simply using a style of moral reasoning that was not being captured by Kohlberg's assessment. As such, they did not fit within his theory, and their voices were not registering. Instead, Gilligan suggested that the women she interviewed used what she called an ethic of care. Their morality was based around care for others rather than appeals to seemingly universal codes of behavior. She believed that this ethic of care was not inherently limited to females, but it was certainly more common. Therefore, the ethic of care was not designed to replace Kohlberg's theory of morality, but rather to complement it. In fact, Gilligan has consistently argued that she would like to see psychology, quote, free itself, both in theory and in methods, from the gender binary and the gender hierarchy, end quote. Her book generated a lot of controversy across all disciplines. A feminist psychologist and mainstream psychologists fell on both sides of the debate, some praising it, some seeing it as deeply problematic. All right, hold on, ladies and gentlemen, because this is going to be a long slide and a bit of a bumpy ride. One cannot talk about Gilligan's theory without first talking about Kohlberg's, because her theory was formed in reaction to his. So, to start, Kohlberg's theory of moral development consists of 3 levels, each made up of 2 stages. At the lowest, the pre-conventional level, the needs of the self are prioritized. This evolves into the conventional level, an understanding of how to be a moral member of society. Finally, at the highest level, the post-conventional level, the individual adopts a universal idea of justice. Kohlberg observed that most people won't reach the highest stages of his scale, but would stop developing morally in the middle stages at the conventional level, and that is what the research showed. However, while both girls and boys tended to score at the conventional level on his scale, girls scored predominantly at stage 3, which is concerned with being a good person in order to maintain the goodwill and approval of others, while most boys scored at stage 4, which is focused on adhering to the norms and laws of society. This made it seem like men reached higher levels of morality than women, but Gilligan noted that Kohlberg's theory was formulated exclusively through research with young white males. As a result, she suggested that Kohlberg's theory is biased toward men and boys and doesn't account for women and girls' perspective on morality. Men, she said, prioritize an ethic of justice where morality is centered on abstract principles and rules that can be applied equally to everyone. Meanwhile, women prioritize an ethic of care, where morality is centered on interpersonal relationships and moral judgment is based on the context of an issue. Gilligan conducted several interview studies with girls and women. The goal of her work was to demonstrate that women don't necessarily stop developing morally before men do, but that their moral development follows a different trajectory than that outlined in Kohlberg's theory. Her research in the abortion decision study led her to detail her own stage theory of moral development, and she used the same basic 3-level outline as Kohlberg did, but she added 2 transitions between the levels. So her first level, pre-conventional morality, moral justice is entirely focused on the self and the need to survive. When a conflict arises between the needs of the self and the needs of others, a woman will choose to address her own needs. Transition 1. During the first transition from the pre-conventional to the conventional level, the woman realizes that she has a responsibility to others. It is the first time that she realizes her previous moral perspective could be characterized as selfish. Level 2, conventional morality. Moral judgment becomes concentrated on caring for others. The woman starts to see herself as a participant in society whose claim to being a good citizen relies on helping and protecting others. This concern for others overrides her concern for self, leading to a morality focused on self-sacrifice. Transition number 2. During the second transition from the conventional to the post-conventional level, the woman starts to experience tension between the needs of others and the needs of the self. She begins to realize she must strike a balance between her needs and the needs of others. Gilligan says this leads to a shift in moral judgment away from goodness to truth, as she starts to honestly assess her own desires, not just her responsibility to others. And finally, the last stage, post-conventional morality. At this level, moral judgment is dictated by the principle of nonviolence. The needs of the self are just as important as the needs of others, which causes the woman to arrive at a universal ethic of care and concern. Adhering to the obligation of care while avoiding harm or exploitation to herself and others enables the woman to accept responsibility for her choices. Gilligan didn't identify specific ages when the levels of moral development would be reached. However, just as Kohlberg did with his theory, she noted some women might not reach the highest level. She also observed that it wasn't life experience that pushed a woman to higher levels, but cognitive ability and changes in a woman's sense of self. Thus, movement through Gilligan's stages of moral development hinges on an evolving sense of self. At the pre-conventional level, only the needs of self are recognized. At the conventional level, the needs of others are prioritized while the needs of self are denied. Lastly, at the post-conventional level, a balance is struck between the needs of the self and others. Transition through these levels is based on a woman's reconsideration of what she considers selfish. Throughout these levels, a woman's sense of self and the sense of morality that arises because of it are driven by their feelings of connection and responsibility towards others, which gradually evolve to encompass others and then expand to encompass everyone, including the self. All right, a little preface to this next slide. If you hear snoring in the background, that's my dog. I did not know how to edit that out. So here we go. Critiques. Can the ethics of care extend to men? While the ethics of care was developed based on research with women, Gilligan states that the ethics of care and the ethics of justice are not mutually exclusive. She does indicate that although men could develop an ethic of care, it was more likely to develop in women. And studies have shown that people have two moral orientations that line up with her ethic of justice and ethic of care. And further studies have found that the moral orientation towards care is stronger in females. Thus, while both men and women can and will develop both orientations, one may be more influential in men than in women, and vice versa. Lastly, research suggests that as people age and reach the highest stage of moral development, the two orientations tend to equalize and are represented in an individual regardless of gender. Next, there are studies which indicate that the gender differences in Kohlberg stages aren't as pronounced as Gilligan surmised, i.e. there may not be a strong gender bias in his work. And just as Gilligan noted that Kohlberg based his research on white males, her research is based on Western culture. Gilligan's observations are the result of societal expectations of gender rather than differences that arise from innate gender differences. Thus, if societal expectations were different, the moral orientations of males and females might also be different. Lastly, some have criticized her theory for reinforcing traditional notions of femininity that could continue to lock women in caregiver roles and for making women's voices seem homogeneous, ignoring the diversity of women based on age, class, race, and other factors.
Our last theorist is Jerome Bruner.
Jerome Bruner was an American psychologist who made significant contributions to cognitive psychology and cognitive learning theory and educational psychology. He taught and did research at Harvard University, the University of Oxford, and NYU. A review of General Psychology survey published in 2002 ranked Bruner as the 28th most cited psychologist of the 20th century. Bruner received a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Duke and went on to earn a master's degree and a doctorate in psychology from Harvard University. During World War II, he served on the Psychological Warfare Division, researching social psychological phenomena. Shortly after receiving his doctorate degree, Bruner tried to join the United States military, but his application was rejected because of his poor eyesight. Instead, he was drafted into the Office for Strategic Studies, a U.S. military intelligence agency. Bruner was part of the staff that worked with members of the U.S. Office of War Information and the British Political Warfare Executive, which formed the Psychological Warfare Division. His assignments included working with wartime propaganda, studying foreign radio broadcasts, and following the invasion force to France to investigate which liberated French villages could be trusted. After World War II, he returned to Harvard as a faculty member. For most of the late 40s, he and Leo Postman conducted research on how needs, motivations, and expectations affect perception. Bruner also became more involved in cognitive psychology and specifically the cognitive development of children. He eventually became a professor of psychology at Harvard in 1952. Bruner's interest in the U.S. school system grew in the late 1950s. After attending a 10-day meeting of scholars and educators, he published The Process of Education. This landmark book sparked many educational programs and experiments during the 1960s. Bruner was asked to join a number of committees and panels, including the President's Advisory Panel of Education for both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. In 1960, Bruner co-founded the Harvard Center for Cognitive Studies. His research focused on cognition and helped to end the dominance of behaviorism in psychological research in America. He also served as the president of the American Psychological Association in 1965. Bruner left Harvard in 1972 to teach at Oxford, and while there, he conducted research on children's language. He returned to the United States in 1980 when he accepted a position at the New School in New York City. He joined the staff at NYU in 1991, where he taught until his death in 2016. He was 101, y'all. 101. Bruner's theory of cognitive development deals with how knowledge is stored or represented in memory. He proposed 3 modes of representation, the first of which develops in infancy, with the other two gradually emerging later. Although these ways of thinking evolve in stage-like progression, we do not abandon them as we move from one phase of development to another. All 3 modes of representation are interconnected and utilized in adulthood. The first stage is inactive. In their first year of life, babies learn primarily by doing, as they interact with their environment through physical actions such as tasting, touching, moving, and grasping. Inactive representations are formed. Knowledge is stored as a series of motor responses, or what we commonly refer to as muscle memory. Adults also make use of this form of representation when they engage in motor tasks such as riding a bike, driving, typing, or playing a musical instrument. The next stage is iconic. As children get older, they develop the ability to store knowledge in the form of mental images or icons. These images may be based on visual, auditory, or other sensory inputs. When we use pictures, maps, diagrams, and videos to aid learning, we are making use of the iconic mode. Last is symbolic. This is the last mode of representation to develop. It involves storing information in the form of abstract symbols rather than images. 2 of the most commonly used symbols are words and numbers. The symbolic mode allows for information to be summarized and more easily manipulated. Greater flexibility and complexity of thought therefore become possible. Most adult thought is stored in the symbolic mode. Bruner strongly believed that children should be active participants in the learning process, rather than passive recipients of knowledge. He promoted the idea of discovery learning, in which children learn through engagement, experimentation, and exploration. From Bruner's standpoint, the objective of instruction should be to help learners become self-sufficient in problem solving. Rather than transmitting prepackaged facts and explanations, teachers should function as facilitators, helping students to discover principles for themselves. This means that teachers would give learners access to necessary information without organizing it for them. The students would sort the information for themselves, discovering in the process the relationships between different concepts and ideas. Bruner's approach to learning has been called a constructivist approach, since it involves the learner actively constructing new ideas based on past and current experiences. The learner attaches meaning to new information based on what they already know. Bruner believed knowledge acquired in this way is better retained than information that is simply passed down from an instructor. Unlike Piaget's theory of cognitive development, Bruner did not believe that children have to reach a particular age or maturational level in order to grasp certain concepts. He argued that any subject matter, including complex concepts, can be presented in a form that is simple enough for a learner at any age to understand. He is famously quoted as saying, "Any subject can be taught effectively in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of development." Bruner advocated a spiral curriculum, in which the same subject matter is taught at various levels with increasing depth and breadth. At first, only basic principles are presented, but as the learner advances to higher levels of education, the subject is revisited with additional details being presented. Learning, therefore, takes place in a spiral fashion, with the learner continually building on what he or she has already learned. Bruner believed learning is most effective when material is presented in sequence from inactive to iconic to symbolic. For example, complex concepts such as the addition of fractions can be taught in inactive form to very young children using tangible fraction circles. As children mature, the other modes of representation can be employed to teach more complex aspects of the topic. Bruner also advocated a process known as scaffolding, in which adults provide ongoing support as children attempt to solve a problem or master a task they are not quite able to manage on their own. The adult provides temporary assistance to maximize the child's growth. Just as how a literal scaffold temporarily supports the building of a tall structure, adults can provide a scaffold in various ways. The aim of scaffolding is to provide just enough support so that the child is able to improve his knowledge, move on to the next stage of the task, and arrive at a solution for himself. The assistance provided must be continually adjusted to meet the changing needs of the learner. At first, the child may be very dependent on the support of the adult, but as he or she acquires the relevant skills and knowledge, the support can be gradually decreased and withdrawn completely over time. Although Bruner's concepts have greatly contributed to education policy in several countries, critics have raised doubts regarding the practicality of some of his ideas. For example, while scaffolding and spiraling offer several advantages to the learner, their effectiveness depends on how knowledgeable their teachers are. In the case of scaffolding, teachers must know when to intervene, when to step back, and how to motivate effectively. They must also be aware of each child's changing needs, which can be difficult in a large classroom where the teacher is not able to monitor each child's progress individually. For spiraling to be effective, teachers must also be familiar with the child's existing knowledge base. If teachers repeat or reteach information that students already know, they run the risk of students losing interest in the topic. On the other hand, if teachers wrongly assume that students remember the fundamental concepts of a topic taught in previous grades, they may frustrate learners when more advanced concepts are introduced. Discovery learning also presents challenges in the classroom, since misconceptions sometimes arise among students as they attempt to construct meaning for themselves. These misconceptions may go undetected by teachers, especially in larger settings. Discovery learning also require large amounts of resources which may not be readily available in some schools. It can also be a challenge to implement this form of learning in settings where behavior management is a problem. Other critics note that discovery learning may not be suitable for students who prefer a more traditional approach to teaching and learning. As some have pointed out, there is no evidence to show that all students are effective at creating meaning on their own. Some students prefer structure and become frustrated when the demands of a task are not clear. Further critics have argued that young children in particular need direct instruction and that the volume of information to be learned at school leaves little time for discovery. It's also noted that a child-centered, process-oriented approach may not be ideal when teaching basic skills such as reading and writing. Research also suggests that when teaching students with learning difficulties, a direct approach is more effective for introducing new information and skills. Lastly, some critics have also taken issue with Bruner's claim that any subject matter can be taught at any age in some honest form. These critics argue that children need to achieve a certain level of maturity in order to handle some concepts, and Bruner himself criticized his own claim over his failure to explain what he meant by the term honest.
Here's some important vocabulary and their definitions to help you understand Bruner's theory a little bit better.
That's all, folks.